Hello folks, and welcome to Volume 2 of my deep dive into Ohio's regional and short-line railroads. In the previous volume, we took a look at my colorful history with regionals and short lines that have found their way into the state of Ohio that are actually not from the state of Ohio. In this volume, we're going to take a look at a regional railroad that is local / semi-local to my area, the Ohio Central Railway. Once owned by a rail fan just like me who founded the railroad in 1988, the Ohio Central Railroad became a GNW-owned property 20 years later in 2008 and operates 500 miles of track between 3 different divisions between central Ohio and western Pennsylvania. Despite being within arm's reach, the Ohio Central Railroad remained overlooked throughout my entire tenure as a rail fan up to this point. However, that is soon to change. Anyways, without further ado, kick your shoes off and relax, grab some popcorn, some snackies, and a beverage of your choice, and let the story commence. My introduction to the Ohio Central Railroad would come on July 29, 2023. While being introduced to me by my current best friend at the time, the first stop of our little trip was the main base of operations in Newark, Ohio, about 47 miles east of Columbus. Our primary target was the Newark to Parsons Road train NKPA, although unfortunately, that train would not be featured during this trip. What was featured at this stop was a very good power set. The power set was included, but not limited to, a pair of company-owned and leased SD40-2s painted in the paint schemes of their former owners, a pair of company-owned GNW painted Jeeps, as well as Ohio Central 4027, an SD40 T2 tunnel motor, my first time seeing this particular build. Keep in mind the time that these were shot, July 2023, was in the midst of a fallout between a huge lawsuit between Genesee and Wyoming and the EPA, where most of the non-GNW painted locomotives were required to be written off and sent for scrap as per settlement from said lawsuit. The next stop of our little trip was a cement plant in the small town of Blacklick, Ohio. Sitting at the plant and assigned to the ECL local was a pair of GEB 23-7Rs, still painted in their former CSX and P&W colors. After serving the company for many decades and gaining a cult following amongst rail fans of this area, the Super 7s were also unfortunately victims of the lawsuit. When the replacement process was complete, all Super 7s were sold to Larry's Truck and Electric for scrap. On the bright side, Ohio Central 4092 has since been donated to Age of Steam Roundhouse, and Ohio Central 3185 has since been immortalized by my HO replica in my model train collection. Just over 2 years later, I would return to the same location in Newark, Ohio on December 19th, 2025. On this day, me and a friend of mine from the Model Railroad Club would venture out far from Class 1 territory in hopes of seeing the Ohio Central in action, which we sort of did, but not really at the same time. Just like last time, a large collection of locomotives were sitting by the water tower, but unlike last time, a good portion of the locomotives were not from the Ohio Central, rather the Indiana and Ohio Railway. The most interesting locomotive sitting in the yard today was Ohio Central 3308, an EMD SD40-2 built in 1979 for the Union Pacific Railroad and still proudly wears its Union Pacific colors to this very day. It is also important to mention that 3308 is, or was, one of the last few locomotives active on Ohio Central's roster that hasn't been painted into the GNW corporate orange and black. If someone could verify if 3308 is still in service, feel free to do so down in the comments below. Also present in Newark today was a portion of Ohio Central's fleet of SD60Ms and SD60Is. These locomotives are the primary source of road power for Ohio Central these days, as these locomotives replaced most of the older stuff that Ohio Central used to have when they were transferred from the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad. The next clips to follow would be an audio sample of an EMD 645 prime mover in idle, in addition to a pair of SD60s, and an SD40-2 briefly working the yard, but we'll let those clips do the talking themselves. The second and final stop of our trip today was the cement plant in Blacklick, Ohio. Sitting behind the fenced-off area is a pair of EMD GP38-2s, assigned to the ECL local. Despite being among the newest acquisitions for Ohio Central, this pair of GP38-2s have a pretty colorful work history, as 3596 was originally built for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and 3578 was originally built for the Texas-Mexican Railroad. After checking out this location, we then had to get back on the road for the trip home as it was extremely cold today. I know what some of you may be thinking right now. Okay, All Ohio, when are we going to truly see Ohio Central in action? Well, you'll get to see that here in just a second. I would return once more to the Ohio Central Newark Rail Yard about a week later on December 26, 2025, just after Christmas. I came out here on a solo trip in hopes of seeing the Ohio Central in action, and I had no idea how well fed I was going to be this morning. Less than 5 minutes after pulling into the yard, a 5-unit set of second and third generation EMDs would be moving around the yard doing some switching. After passing the camera once, the yard power would back into one of the storage tracks to drop off the trio of SD60s on the back of the consist. For other Columbus area rail fans who want to come here and see the Ohio Central do their things, make sure you're on the outside of the fence as the gate is pretty much open at all times. As long as you're on the outside of the fence, the railroad and local law enforcement will not bug you. After backing the SD60s into the storage track, the pair of SD40-2s would then break off and do some switching at some local industries at the mouth of the yard, which we'll see in a little bit. After watching a little bit of yard action, let's take a closer look at the locomotives that are sitting in the yard today. As stated earlier in the video, most of Ohio Central's roster as of 2025 consists of SD60Ms and SD60Is. When you do some research on these locomotives, you'll find that these SD60s have ties to Conrail in addition to CSX and Norfolk Southern. Also stated earlier, these locomotives were transferred from the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad in 2023. The purpose for this was to replace the older stuff Ohio Central used to use, which was required to be written off and scrapped by the EPA. Over the last year and a half, Ohio Central has added new logos to their fleet of SD60s to denote their true ownership. However, a small handful of them, at least 2 or 3, still carry their original Buffalo and Pittsburgh markings as shown here with SD60I 3882. Also here were a pair of GP38-2s lettered for the Ohio Central in Indiana and Ohio respectively. Most of the 4-axle Jeeps across G&W's companies trace back to the Southern Railway and Norfolk Southern, as shown by the I&O Jeep that's partially obscured by the trees with the bell on the long hood. As we get into the more interesting group, we have a sister pair of EMD SD40-2s, 3339 and 3340, both locomotives tracing their roots back to the Burlington Northern or the subsidiaries to Burlington Northern in 3339's case. Rounding out the interesting group is Ohio Central 3892 and LTEX 2516, another pair of SD60Ms. The roots of 3892 trace back to the Burlington Northern as evident by the Triclops cab, and 2516's roots trace back to the Union Pacific as it still wears its Union Pacific colors to this day. It is also important to mention prior to the arrival of the Buffalo and Pittsburgh locomotives, Ohio Central had a larger fleet of leased ex-Union Pacific SD60Ms from Larry's Truck and Electric. While that yard crew was moving around all those locomotives, another yard crew would leave the yard on the west end to do some switching at customers at the mouth of the yard. I would move just up the road from the water tower to the Y that's on the west end in hopes of seeing what this yard crew was doing. To give you a better perspective of this location, you can see the water tower fading out of view to the left side as this yard crew continues to put their train together. This particular location on the west end of the yard gives you a clear view of Ohio Central when they're switching said customers that are also located here. I would soon find out that this is not a typical yard train, but rather the SIO turn job that operates on a round trip between Coshocton, Ohio and Newark, Ohio. I would find out this piece of information while walking down South Morris Street on a phone call and nearly missed the SIO train departing Newark for the trip back to Coshocton. After the SIO train departed Newark, I would move back to the Y outside the yard as I knew the other pair of EMDs would be working close by. I would find that this train would stay in Newark as they were working the same industries that the SIO train was working previously. With the switching at the local industries within the yard limits being complete, the yard crew would then make their way back in, and I would get some nice photos of this XUP and INO pair. After after this, I would notice that they would swap leaders and then couple back up to the SD60s from earlier. After driving back to the water tower, they were all moving again, with the additional SD40-2 pair on the back of the locomotive consist. It would appear that the yard crews were wrapping up their morning's work as the G&W SD40-2 pair went on storage track number 1 under the water tower, and the SD60s would go to storage track number 2 alongside. SD60s on storage track number 2, whether if they continue to work throughout the morning or were done for the day will remain a mystery, as I have figured now would be a good time for me to get back on the road for the trip home. And with that, we now conclude the second volume covering Ohio's regional and short line railroads. It's nothing short of a mystery that this short line was overlooked in my rail fanning endeavors despite being the closest one to me. It took quite some time for me to figure out the operations of this railroad and find locations along said railroad that were actually safe. As shown by the third act of this video, I was able to find a strategy that worked for me. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out some other ones of mine. Leave a like or a comment down below to share your thoughts, subscribe if you're new, and tap the notifications bell if you want to be notified when a new video gets posted here on the channel just like this. Until next time, this is All Ohio Railfan, signing off.